The applause for the company's quarterly success hadn't even faded when security escorted its quietest employee toward the exit. Minutes later, the front doors burst open, and the founder's furious voice echoed across the stunned office. "Who let her leave?" The words cut through the open-plan office so sharply that even the constant hum of keyboards seemed to stop. Dozens of heads turned at once. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Someone slowly lowered a coffee mug without taking a sip. Standing in the middle of the floor, surrounded by rows of glass-walled meeting rooms and glowing monitors, Sarah Mitchell looked at the folder that had just been placed into her hands. Beside her stood a human resources representative, wearing the practiced expression of someone determined to appear compassionate without becoming involved. Across from her, the company's newly hired Chief Operating Officer, Daniel Brooks, straightened his expensive suit jacket and spoke loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "As part of our modernization initiative, your position has been eliminated. Your access will be revoked within the hour. Security will escort you from the building after you've collected your belongings." The silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. No one dared interrupt. A few coworkers exchanged uneasy glances before quickly pretending to return to their screens, but it was impossible not to watch. Public firings were rare, and everyone understood the message hidden beneath the corporate language. If an employee with 10 years at the company could disappear before lunch, anyone could. Daniel seemed almost satisfied by the audience. Fear, after all, was an efficient management tool. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't ask for another chance. She didn't remind anyone of the weekends she had spent inside the server room while the rest of the city celebrated holidays. She simply nodded once, thanked the HR representative for bringing the paperwork, and walked back to her desk with a calmness that somehow made the entire scene even more uncomfortable. Daniel expected resistance. Instead, he received silence. A silence that lingered across the office like the first distant rumble before a storm. Most people in the building knew Sarah only as the quiet woman from infrastructure. She wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, never competed for promotions, and rarely joined office gossip. Few realized she had been arriving before sunrise for almost a decade, long before the first elevator filled with employees carrying designer coffee cups. While executives proudly demonstrated sleek new banking platforms to investors, Sarah spent her mornings maintaining the invisible foundation beneath them all, the legacy banking infrastructure that processed millions of transactions every single day. It wasn't glamorous work. The software had been written years before many employees graduated from college. Its documentation was incomplete, its architecture complicated, and its behavior filled with quirks that only experience could explain. Everyone wanted to replace it eventually. Until then, everyone depended on it. The irony was almost beautiful. Because the system almost never failed, executives assumed it no longer required anyone exceptional to maintain it. Success had become invisible. Every smooth transaction, every uninterrupted business day, every crisis prevented before it reached the headlines, quietly erased evidence that someone had been protecting the company all along. Daniel had spent barely 3 weeks studying organizational charts before deciding that legacy systems represented unnecessary cost. He had never entered the restricted server room, never spoken with the engineers who quietly relied on Sarah whenever something behaved in ways no manual could explain. He reduced 10 years of knowledge to a single salary figure on a spreadsheet and proudly presented it as operational efficiency. As Sarah packed her desk into a plain cardboard box, the office around her returned to its artificial rhythm. Phones rang, meetings resumed. Someone laughed too loudly in a nearby conference room, trying to convince themselves everything was normal. Into the box went a framed photograph of her parents, 2 coffee mugs collected during forgotten company anniversaries, a small green plant that had somehow survived every office renovation, and finally a worn leather notebook. It looked ordinary enough that no one paid attention to it. Inside were years of handwritten observations that had never found their way into official documentation. Unusual system behaviors, emergency recovery sequences, forgotten authentication paths, undocumented dependencies, and dozens of lessons learned during nights when the company's banking network had balanced on a single correct decision. She slipped the notebook into her bag before security even noticed it. By the time her monitor suddenly went black, her credentials had already been disabled. The timing was almost symbolic. 10 years of service erased with a single automated command. Sarah quietly picked up the box, thanked the security officer who held the elevator door open, and walked through the lobby beneath a massive digital display celebrating the company's most successful quarter in history. Animated graphs climbed confidently toward the ceiling, while smiling executives appeared in promotional videos praising innovation and bold leadership. Employees applauded somewhere upstairs as another presentation began. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass facade, turning the city into a blur of silver reflections. Sarah stepped through the revolving doors without looking back. Behind the windows, several senior engineers watched her leave in complete silence. None of them spoke the thought that crossed every experienced mind at exactly the same moment. They weren't afraid because the company had fired an employee. They were afraid because the company had just fired the only person who truly understood the system that kept everything alive. Sometimes the biggest corporate mistake looks perfectly reasonable until the first crack finally appears. The first alarm sounded at exactly 10:43 a.m., less than an hour after Sarah Mitchell had walked out of the building carrying nothing more than a cardboard box and 10 years of experience. No spreadsheet had ever managed to measure. At first, nobody treated it as anything unusual. Banking systems produced warnings every day, and engineers were trained to separate harmless noise from real danger. But within minutes, the operations center transformed from its usual calm rhythm into controlled chaos. Red indicators began spreading across monitoring screens like drops of ink bleeding through paper. Payment queues that normally cleared in seconds suddenly stopped moving. Internal verification services started timing out one after another, while customer support agents found themselves answering an endless stream of identical calls from frustrated clients asking why transfers were frozen. The room filled with overlapping conversations, ringing desk phones, hurried footsteps, and the sharp clicking of keyboards as dozens of specialists searched for an explanation that refused to reveal itself. Check the authentication cluster again. It's healthy. Then why aren't transactions clearing? Because something downstream isn't responding. Restart it. Already did. Run diagnostics. Nothing's pointing to a hardware failure. The more they searched, the less sense the problem made. Every system appeared alive, yet the entire infrastructure behaved as though one invisible thread had quietly been pulled from the center of an enormous web. Standing behind them with growing irritation, Daniel Brooks watched the confusion escalate before finally raising his voice. I don't care what it takes. Find the problem and fix it. We are not explaining an outage to the board because one employee left the building. No one answered immediately. Instead, Mark Reynolds, the senior infrastructure engineer who had worked beside Sarah for nearly 8 years, slowly pushed himself away from his workstation and looked directly at Daniel. There was no anger in his expression anymore, only exhaustion. That's exactly the problem, he said calmly. You keep saying one employee, but Sarah wasn't one employee. She was the reason half of this system never became anyone else's emergency. Daniel folded his arms, clearly unconvinced. You're telling me a billion-dollar financial company depends on one person? Mark shook his head. No, I'm telling you this company depended on someone it spent 10 years pretending it didn't need. Another engineer joined the conversation without looking up from his monitor. "We've rebuilt the verification service twice," a database specialist added. "Replication is healthy." Someone from network operations muttered, "Traffic is normal." Another voice came from the back of the room. "Then why are settlement requests disappearing?" Nobody had an answer. Daniel slammed his palm against the conference table hard enough to make several coffee cups jump. "What about documentation? We have procedures for everything." Mark reached into a nearby cabinet and dropped 3 thick binders onto the table with a dull thud. Daniel flipped through page after page, expecting a simple checklist. Instead, he found diagrams, outdated flowcharts, maintenance notes, and technical explanations that described what the infrastructure looked like, but not why it behaved the way it did under pressure. Mark quietly broke the silence. "Documentation tells you how to start the engine." Sarah knew why it sometimes refused to start when everything looked normal. Across the street, Sarah sat beside the cafe window, watching rain slide down the glass in shimmering lines that blurred the company headquarters into little more than a gray silhouette. Her cardboard box rested untouched beside her chair. For the first time in 10 years, she had nowhere she urgently needed to be. She wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee that had already begun to cool when her phone started vibrating almost continuously. First came Mark, then Lisa from cybersecurity, then Ethan from database operations, then 3 more coworkers in less than 5 minutes. She finally answered Mark's call. Before she could say hello, she heard voices arguing in the background. "Tell her we're sorry. Ask if she's okay. Don't pressure her." Mark sighed heavily. "Sarah, everything's falling apart." She remained quiet. "Nobody knows what's happening," he continued. "Daniel keeps demanding quick fixes, but we're chasing ghosts. Every time we solve one issue, 2 more appear somewhere else." Sarah looked down into her coffee. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that." "No," Mark replied immediately. "We're sorry you're the one sitting in a cafe after everything you've done for this place." Another familiar voice interrupted the call. It was Lisa. "Can I say something?" Without waiting for permission, she spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You know what really makes me angry? Management kept telling us everyone is replaceable. Funny how they only discovered your value after escorting you out the front door." Several people around her laughed bitterly. Someone else added, "This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. We're all tired of being treated like expenses instead of people." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Their words hurt more than the firing itself because she knew they were sincere. "Take care of each other," she said softly. "That's more important than taking my side." Mark answered almost immediately, "That's exactly what we're trying to do." Back inside headquarters, panic was no longer confined to the IT department. Finance executives demanded updates every 15 minutes. Customer relations reported growing complaints from partner banks. Compliance officers began asking whether regulators would need to be notified if the disruption continued much longer. The atmosphere changed completely. The confident executives who had applauded the company's record-breaking quarter only hours earlier now walked the hallways with tense expressions, whispering behind closed conference room doors. Then, at exactly 3:17 p.m., every executive received the same email. The subject line contained only 3 words: "Emergency Board Meeting." Daniel opened it, expecting another status request. But as his eyes reached the final sentence, the color slowly disappeared from his face. "The founder has landed and is on the way to headquarters. Attendance is mandatory." Around him, conversations stopped almost instantly. Someone whispered, "He's coming back?" Another replied, "He hasn't been here in almost a year." Mark looked toward the executive offices and quietly said to no one in particular, "Now someone is finally going to ask the question none of us were allowed to ask this morning." They still believed the worst part of the day was behind them. They had no idea the real storm had only just arrived. Have you ever seen a company realize someone's value only after they left? Subscribe for more stories like this and share your experience in the comments. I'd love to read it. The elevator doors had barely finished opening before the mood inside headquarters changed completely. Employees who had spent the last hour whispering in corners suddenly fell silent as a tall man with silver hair and a dark navy overcoat strode through the lobby without slowing his pace. Richard Donovan, the company's founder, almost never came to the office anymore. Most people only saw him during annual shareholder meetings or company-wide broadcasts. Yet everyone who had worked there long enough remembered one thing about him. When Richard walked this fast, something was seriously wrong. He ignored the receptionist's greeting, brushed past a group of executives waiting near the elevators, and stopped only when another alert echoed through the operations center. Large screens lining the wall flashed red again. Customer complaints continued climbing. Payment queues stretched longer every minute. Richard scanned the room for only a few seconds before asking a question that caught everyone off guard. "Who's leading infrastructure?" Nobody answered immediately. Daniel Brooks stepped forward, adjusted his jacket, and forced a confident smile. "I'm overseeing the situation." Richard looked directly into his eyes. "That's not what I asked." The silence grew heavier. Finally, Mark Reynolds spoke from the back of the room. "Sarah Mitchell was leading it." Richard nodded once. "Was?" Mark hesitated. "She was terminated this morning." Richard's expression didn't change, but everyone nearby felt the temperature in the room drop. "Terminated?" he repeated quietly. Daniel quickly stepped in. "It was part of our modernization initiative. We eliminated several legacy positions to reduce operational costs and improve efficiency." Richard slowly turned toward him. "Did you just say legacy positions?" "Yes." "Including Sarah Mitchell?" "Correct." Daniel tried to sound certain, but every word came out weaker than the last. Richard took 2 slow steps forward until only a few feet separated them. "Tell me something, Daniel. Before signing those papers, did you ever ask who maintained the transaction recovery protocols?" Daniel remained silent. "Did you ask who redesigned the overnight settlement process after the outage 8 years ago?" No answer. "Did you ask who personally stayed in this building for 36 straight hours when the banking network almost collapsed?" Several employees lowered their heads. Richard looked around the room before his voice finally rose for the first time. "Then who let her leave?" The words echoed through the operations center. Conversations stopped. Phones continued ringing, but nobody reached for them. Even the executive standing behind Daniel looked away. Daniel tried to recover. "Richard, with respect, we believed the system was fully documented." The founder let out a short laugh that contained no amusement whatsoever. "You believed?" He pointed toward the wall of monitoring screens. "This is what belief looks like without experience." Mark quietly placed one of the thick documentation binders on the conference table. Richard opened it, flipped through several pages, then closed it again. "These manuals explain procedures," he said. "They don't explain judgment. They don't explain why Sarah knew which warning could be ignored and which one meant the company had exactly 20 minutes before millions of dollars stopped moving." One engineer couldn't hold back anymore. "She used to say the system had a personality." Another nodded. "We laughed every time." Richard looked at both of them. She wasn't joking. He turned back to Daniel. "Some people memorize software. Others understand it. You fired the second kind." Before Daniel could answer, another engineer hurried into the room carrying a tablet. His face had gone pale. "Sir, we've just lost synchronization with one of the backup processing clusters." Every head turned. "Can you restore it?" Richard asked calmly. The engineer swallowed hard. Normally, yes. And now? Sarah handled the failover sequence manually because of an undocumented conflict that appears only under specific transaction loads. Daniel immediately interrupted. Figure it out. The engineer shook his head. We're trying. Nobody knows the sequence. Another specialist joined in. We've tested 3 recovery methods. Results? Richard asked. Every attempt creates another problem. Someone else muttered. It's like pulling the wrong brick from a wall. Richard looked toward the operations screens filled with growing queues of delayed transactions. No, he said quietly. It's worse. You're removing support beams from a building that's still full of people. Within minutes, the boardroom filled with directors who had abandoned meetings across the building. The emergency session began without its usual presentations or polished financial reports. Nobody cared about quarterly profits anymore. Richard stood at the head of the table, while Daniel attempted to explain the restructuring plan using charts prepared only days earlier. He barely reached the 3rd slide before Richard raised his hand. Stop. The projector froze. How much money did this restructuring save? Daniel cleared his throat. Approximately $1.8 million annually. Richard nodded. And how much has today's disruption already cost? The chief financial officer quietly answered before Daniel could speak. Based on current estimates, more than $3 million. The room fell silent. Richard looked around the table. So before this day is over, we've already lost nearly twice what we hoped to save. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. As the meeting continued, Richard quietly reached into his jacket pocket and removed an old employee badge. It was faded around the edges, its photo nearly worn away with time. Several board members leaned forward, confused. Richard placed it in the center of the table. This belonged to Sarah during her first year here. I kept it because she earned it the hard way. He smiled faintly for the first time all day. Most of you don't know this, but when this company nearly failed a decade ago, Sarah volunteered to stay through an entire holiday weekend while everyone else evacuated the building during a severe storm warning. She never asked for overtime. She never asked for recognition. She only asked if the systems were stable. His smile disappeared. And today, someone decided that person was expendable. No one spoke. Because for the first time since the crisis began, everyone in the room understood that the biggest problem wasn't the failing system. It was the decision that had started the failure. Get Sarah Mitchell back, right now. Richard Donovan's voice was calm, but it struck the boardroom harder than any shout could have. Nobody reached for a laptop. Nobody dared interrupt. Just minutes earlier, executives had been arguing over incident reports and financial projections, desperately searching for someone else to blame as transaction delays spread across the banking network. Now every eye was fixed on the founder. Daniel Brooks finally cleared his throat. Richard, bringing her back won't solve the structural problem. This only proves the company became too dependent on one employee. Richard slowly turned toward him. No, Daniel. It proves management spent years depending on one employee while convincing itself it wasn't. The room fell silent. The chief financial officer quietly projected the latest numbers onto the screen. More than $5 million in delayed transactions. Several corporate clients had already suspended large transfers until the system stabilized. 2 partner banks were demanding explanations. Richard barely looked at the figures before asking one question. Who approved Sarah's termination? Daniel raised his hand with forced confidence. I did. Richard nodded once. And did anyone from infrastructure tell you she couldn't be replaced overnight? Daniel hesitated. Before he could answer, Mark Reynolds pushed a printed email across the polished table. Richard picked it up and read the subject line aloud. Risk of critical knowledge loss during infrastructure restructuring. The email had been sent 3 weeks earlier. Recipient Daniel Brooks. Status, red. No reply. Richard slowly folded the paper, placed it back on the table, and looked around the room. So nobody ignored the risk. His eyes settled on Daniel. You ignored it. At that exact moment, another engineer burst into the boardroom without knocking, something nobody would normally dare to do. He wasn't even looking at the executives. His attention was locked on the tablet shaking slightly in his hands. We're losing another settlement cluster. The room instantly erupted. Can you recover it? The CTO asked. We've tried every documented procedure. And? None of them work, Mark answered before anyone else could. Because Sarah never documented that recovery sequence. Daniel threw his hands into the air. Then why wasn't it documented? Mark looked at him in disbelief. Because every time she requested 2 weeks to finish documenting the legacy platform, management rejected it. They said it wasn't billable work. The words landed like a hammer. Several directors exchanged uncomfortable looks. One of them quietly admitted, I remember approving that budget cut. Another executive lowered his head. So do I. Richard stood up from his chair. For 10 years, this woman asked for time to protect the company. Instead, we kept giving her more emergencies to solve. Nobody argued because everybody in the room suddenly realized the crisis hadn't started that morning. It had started years ago, one ignored request at a time. Across town, Sarah had almost reached home when her phone rang again. Unknown number. She declined it. It rang again, then again. Finally, she answered with a tired sigh. Sarah speaking. The familiar voice on the other end surprised her. It's Richard. She remained silent. I'm not calling to ask you to fix the servers, he continued. I'm calling because I failed you. Sarah looked through her windshield at the rain falling across the quiet street. You trusted the wrong people. Richard didn't deny it. I did, and now my employees are paying for it. Another pause followed before he spoke again. Would you meet me, not as your founder, as the man who should have stopped this before it happened? Sarah closed her eyes. She thought about the applause that had filled the lobby when profits were announced. She thought about the security guard apologizing as she left. She thought about Mark, Lisa, and everyone still trapped inside a building where years of loyalty had been reduced to a cost-saving exercise. Finally, she answered, I'll come. But if this meeting is only about saving your systems, you're calling the wrong person. Richard's reply came without hesitation. No, Sarah. It's about saving the company from the people who forgot what built it in the first place. Sarah didn't sit down when she entered the boardroom. Every executive around the table expected her to head straight for the technical diagrams covering the screens, but she didn't even glance at them. Instead, she looked directly at Richard Donovan. Before anyone asks me to recover a single server, I need one answer. If I save the company today, will everything go back to the way it was yesterday? The question hung over the room like a warning. Richard slowly shook his head. No. Sarah nodded once. Good, because that's the only reason I came back. She turned toward the board. You don't have an infrastructure problem. You have a leadership problem. Systems fail. People make mistakes. But when one employee becomes the only person standing between a company and disaster, management has already failed. Nobody interrupted. Even Daniel Brooks remained silent. Sarah continued. For years I requested documentation time, cross-training, backup engineers. Every request was rejected because it didn't generate immediate profit. Today you're paying for every one of those decisions. Richard stood up. Then tell us what has to change. Sarah answered without hesitation. First, every critical system will be documented before another feature is approved. Second, engineers responsible for infrastructure will have a permanent seat in executive planning meetings. Third, no department head will be allowed to reject technical risk assessments without board review. Fourth, The entire infrastructure team receives a 20% salary increase, including me, not as a reward, but because retaining knowledge is cheaper than replacing it. Several directors exchanged surprised looks, but none of them argued. They had already seen the price of ignoring those requests. Richard looked around the room. Any objections? None came. Approved. Daniel finally broke the silence. Richard, you can't seriously believe this is entirely my fault. Richard looked at him calmly. No, the responsibility belongs to everyone who ignored the warnings. He paused before adding, but you were the one who signed the termination papers, ignored the risk report, withheld it from the board, and chose short-term savings over operational security. The general counsel slid a folder across the table. Inside were emails, budget decisions, rejected documentation requests, and the unanswered warning Mark had presented earlier. An independent investigation starts today, the lawyer announced. Until it's complete, Daniel Brooks is relieved of all executive responsibilities. Daniel stared around the room, expecting someone to defend him. Nobody spoke. The same executives who had supported his cost-cutting strategy only hours earlier now lowered their eyes. He quietly collected his belongings and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, and for the first time that day, the room felt lighter. The recovery itself took less than 2 hours. Sarah worked beside Mark, Lisa, and the infrastructure team, not alone, but together. Every step was documented, every command was explained. Younger engineers asked questions she had never had time to answer before, and this time, nobody rushed them. One by one, the failed systems returned to green. Transaction queues emptied. Corporate clients resumed processing. Messages of relief spread across every department. When the final dashboard confirmed full recovery, applause broke out across the operations floor, louder than it had been during the quarterly profits announcement. Richard watched from the balcony before turning to Sarah. 10 years ago, I founded this company because I believed people would always matter more than numbers. Somewhere along the way, we forgot. Sarah smiled faintly. Then don't remember it only because you almost lost everything. Richard extended his hand once more. This time, she accepted it. Not because she needed the job, but because the company had finally earned back her respect. Around them, engineers returned to work, knowing their voices would no longer be ignored. And everyone in the building understood the real lesson of that day. The most valuable system in any company isn't the technology. It's the people who quietly keep it alive until someone is foolish enough to think they're replaceable. The end.